starting in just a couple of minutes. Stay with us. Good morning. Welcome to all of you joining us today to our virtual ASCOA for this amazing panel. We calling it Confronting the Education Crisis, How to Rebuild Latin America's Human Capital. I'm Cecilia Tornaghi. I'm the managing editor for America's Quarterly. And as the pandemic progressed, we at America's Quarterly, every editorial meeting, we kept asking ourselves that as devastating as COVID was, well, still is for millions of people, what about this other insidious, long-lasting aftershock coming from school closures, which is impacting an entire generation, kids, young adults, all left out of the classroom, and in Latin America for longer than anywhere else, 230 days on average, as per the IDB projections. We, of course, are parents or students, but even if we were to look beyond the human or humanitarian issue at hand, this crisis can and could have a really long-lasting impact to kids' lives and therefore to our economies as well. Who will innovate? Who will take the jobs of the future? And, you know, according to the World Bank projections, 17 trillion lost earnings for this generation. So we dedicated our last issue to this question. We're launching it today. This is a discussion that needs to keep going much further. So we decided to have this panel today, and to help us dive deeper into this challenge, we invited two main voices when it comes to education in Latin America. We have with us today Fernando Reimers. He's the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and a Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University. And Fernando is also the co-editor for a book that is seminal that everybody should read if you're interested in this topic, Learning to Build Back Better Futures for Education, Lessons from Education Innovation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lots of interesting nuggets in that book for if you're looking to actually find people that found solutions. And we have with us, of course, Claudia Costin. Claudia also almost doesn't need an introduction here either. She's the founder and director of the Center for Education Policies and professor at Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. She was Secretary of Education for Rio and, of course, formerly Senior Director for Education at the World Bank until up to 2016, knows the region and the world, the issue around the world deeply, and is also on the board of UNESCO's Education Institution Group. So this event today is in partnership with CEBRI. CEBRI is the Brazilian Center for International Relations. And we, of course, welcome you all to participate. Please send your questions, take part on this conversation. You can, if you're on the WebEx platform, you can use the chat function and send us questions. And for those of you watching us online, you can tweet at us. Use the hashtag at ASCOA with a handle at ASCOA, and you'll reach us with your questions. It will be held in English, but feel free to send questions in Portuguese or Spanish if you're more comfortable. Não tem problema. Pode mandar em qualquer língua. But let's dive right in. We, and by we, I mean Latin America, we had made undeniable strides, through the 2000s, but still, prior to the pandemic, we were still scoring rather poorly when it comes to education attainment and quality, especially. So I would like to start with you, Claudia, if you can help us assess where we were at before this, this disaster, so to speak, this global pandemic started, and how dangerous or damaging do you think the impact was from that level of starting point, so to speak? I'm sorry, got confused here.
So good morning, Cecilia. Good morning, my good friend Fernando Reimers. Good morning to all that are watching us. Yes, we had many challenges prior to the COVID pandemic in Latin America. Unfortunately, if we look at the PISA ranking, the PISA is an international exam organized by the OECD, where countries can be compared because it's not based on national curricula, but on the abilities, the skills necessary to thrive as adults. Unfortunately, we are at the bottom third of the PISA ranking, Latin America. And more than that, prior to the pandemic, we had already huge inequalities in learning. There are reasons for that. Many countries in the region, and let me talk about Brazil specifically in this case, were very late to universalize the access to elementary education, or what we call internationally primary education. If you look at primary plus lower secondary, Brazil was only universalized access, though not conclusion, in the first decade of the 21st century. So that impacted the possibilities of learning. And social inequality and educational inequality build together a vicious circle that needs to be addressed. Well, what are the losses and what are the damages of the pandemic on that scenario? They're terrible. Some people are now attempting to, we would say in Latin America, to brush the dust under the carpet, to put
sweep under the rug, right?
Sweep under the rug. And we could not do it. The losses are terrible. If we talk only about early literacy, unfortunately, many kids in 5th and 6th grade, for example, haven't been able to consolidate their early literacy, which they were supposed to do so at that level, and which establishes what the World Bank calls a learning crisis. And so if we don't develop remedial education, potent and competent enough to deal with that, especially Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, because Chile is improving its education, and even Peru, which was at the bottom some years ago of the PISA ranking, Peru has been improving on a steady and regular pace since the 2012 or 2000. So yes, we can achieve some remedial education, but don't forget that for high schoolers, the situation is quite different. They don't have the time to remediate. And I'll stop here to allow more interaction.
Yeah, the time, right? Some numbers that have been researching for this magazine that show some really scary numbers in terms of how long it will be needed for kids to catch up. But Fernando, on your article for America's Quarterly and also through the book and the main premise, you use even a quote there in your book. Once you quote somebody else, once in a century chance to reset. But where to start will be the priorities. In your article, you say we can choose a path to rebuild better. So what you say that should be a priority? We, of course, have governments dealing with political fireworks, let's put it this way, across the region. We also have very narrow fiscal space, if any, in many, many countries. So what would you prioritize? Where should we start? And can we, what are the choices that you say that we have to make? You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for the invitation. It's great to be here with you and with Claudia. And I'm delighted that the America Society has organized this meeting that has brought into this conversation people who care about the future of education in Latin America, but who themselves may not be directly working in education, because I do think that making the best out of this very difficult crisis is going to require the commitment and the stepping up of a whole range of people, not just governments and educators. Look, if we had been having this conversation in 1350 in Italy after the Black Death, we would have all been lamenting the tragedy that this pandemic had caused in Italy, wiped out the entire population of the country in a couple of years. But we might have missed the interesting disruptions that this pandemic was causing in the small city of Florence, which eventually brought about the Italian Renaissance. And that's how I'd like to think about this terrible moment of crisis and of loss. Undeniable, this is a calamity. But it is also the possibility of bringing about a Renaissance. There's nothing automatic, of course, that's going to lead us there. The Renaissance in Italy happened because there were people who exercised leadership, who had tremendous vision of understanding that this was an opportunity to transform essentially the culture of medieval Italy. And I think this is the opportunity in education here. Over the last 2 years, with my colleagues in the Global Initiative, we have conducted a research program that has led to the publication of 5 books and a range of other publications, which both document the educational impact of the pandemic, but also examine the good things that are happening. And the good news is that in 2 books, the one you mentioned and another one, we examine 75 innovations that generated during this pandemic that really have the potential not just to bring us back to where the education system was before the pandemic, but to a better place. What do I mean by a better place? A place where the education system reaches everyone, helps them gain the competencies that they need to be active, engaged citizens in democratic societies and to contribute value to economies that can function on the base of knowledge, at the high end of the value chain. And that isn't just going to happen, returning to the education systems we had before, because those systems actually failed to educate many children and didn't teach them what they need. There were good efforts in place that had been advanced over the last 2 decades prior to the pandemic to try to update the curriculum, make it more relevant, tackle the difficult question of increasing the capacities of teachers. But clearly, in many ways, it was trying to produce incremental improvements in a system that was very flawed in many ways. And the pandemic has helped us re-examine that. So as I think about the 75 innovations that at least I and my colleagues have studied, this is what I think we should keep in mind. We need to move towards a system. We certainly should forget the narrative of returning to where we were, this notion of recovering learning loss, because that suggests that going back to the levels that Claudia was describing would be useful. And that reflects a tremendous poverty of imagination and aspirations. I mean, who would want to go back to a system where the students perform in the bottom third of the world distributions of scores? Who would want to go back to a system where most of the kids spend years in school only to repeat grade after grade and to walk out of school with the bare capacity to understand what they read? That should not be the goal. The goal should be to build systems where we have tremendous clarity, number one, on what are the competencies that matter. And we let go of this obsession with content. So many people have been concerned with stuffing all the content that wasn't delivered over the last 2 years to the students. And we should let go of that and say, look, what is it that students should be able to do, know, and care about so that they can both participate in knowledge-based economies and in democratic societies? Number two, we should build systems with much greater capacity to personalize, in a given classroom, students are at very different levels. So it is necessary for teachers to know how to teach at the right level, but it's also necessary for students to be able to pursue the things that interest them. And there are simple ways in which we can do that, some of which are happening in Latin America. For example, universities in Latin America increasingly are offering courses online. A simple change that would just require a change in regulation would be to make it possible for students in high schools to take college-level courses online and to receive credit on their transcripts and substitute those courses for what is required in the curriculum. That's not going to solve all the problems, but it is a cheap way to begin to expand the range of options for students so that if you have a student who loves physics, they can actually access college-level physics and not be bored to their teeth with a teacher that is trying to teach to the average, which for some students is just frankly not challenging enough. So that's an example. But I think more generally, what the pandemic has shown is the great potential of online technology to extend opportunities to learn. It also has shown us the many limitations, both in connectivity, access, in digital skills to benefit from that. So that should be a priority in the future. What should be a priority in the future is to build blended systems. I'm not suggesting that the students, that we should use half of the time that students spend in schools, which is too short to begin with, and devote it online. I am suggesting that we should augment that time by providing students opportunities to pursue their own interests, to recover things that they haven't learned, to pursue different paths. And these would involve using a range of options from the college level courses that I'm describing to things like Khan Academy or other modalities so that we augment the capacity of the system. Along the lines of augmenting the capacity of the system, which I think we need to do, we have to stop thinking about the school as the right unit of analysis because frankly, that invention of 200 years ago is too small to deliver what we need in the 21st century. And how do we augment the capacity of the school? In various ways. Number one, we build much more robust relationships with families, with partnerships, which the pandemic has shown us is the only way to make sure that students learn. Sadly, in many places in Latin America, in public schools, there is still a culture of education that sees the families as the people who have to stay outside the school wall, the school fence, and the job of teaching is up to the teachers. And the truth is that students should be learning all the time and there should be seamless continuity and good communication between parents and students. So that's one way to augment the capacity. The second one is connect schools in networks. Some of the innovations that we have studied are the product not of schools working in isolation, not of teachers working in isolation in their classrooms, but of schools that are connected to networks within their countries, very often transnational networks. The Teach for All Network, for example, an organization that brings together people working in 70 countries, has been a tremendous resource of innovation, of creativity, as teachers in Chile were inspired by teachers in Nigeria, and they in turn inspired teachers in Colombia. So we've seen the power of doing an education where just about every other sector does nowadays, which is to understand that the world is a big, rich laboratory from which we can learn, and that there is no need to reinvent the wheel, that we can access knowledge that is generated almost in real time for the purpose of innovation, for the purpose of improvement. The third way to augment the capacity of schools, in addition to connecting better with families and networks, is bring universities into the picture. One of the studies that we conducted, to which Claudia contributed, was a study of how 20 universities around the world during the pandemic partnered with education systems for the purpose of helping them innovate during the pandemic. And many of them are in Latin America. Frankly, I think this is the time for universities to step up to the crisis and to really embrace their potential to be engines of economic and social progress of their communities. And the easiest way to do that is to partner with education systems and to ask the question of how can we help in this task of reprioritizing curriculum, focusing on competencies, building the capacities of teachers, building these blended teachers, So I think these, and then the fourth opportunity to build, to augment the capacity of schools is bring employers into the picture. Here's a really easy, low-hanging fruit to augment the capacity of the high school curriculum, just like we could provide the opportunity for students to take online college courses, create internships, workplace internships. First of all, for students, so that they know what it's like to be in a work setting, whether in the summer and so on. Extremely powerful way to develop a range of the capacities that people need to function in the real world. But second, and this is an opportunity for employers, for chambers of commerce, to ask themselves, what can we do to contribute? And one of the things they can do to contribute is provide students an opportunity to see what a workplace looks like, provide them a mentor, help them discover a purpose for their education, help them see in action what is the use of the math, of the physics, of the chemistry that they're learning in schools. Now, I also think it's necessary to make a big investment in the capacity of teachers. And I think in order to do that, of course, schools of education are going to be an important priority, but we also should augment the capacity of schools of education, which in too many places are too isolated from the needs of the society. So I envision the opportunity for teachers to spend a little bit of time. Why not develop professional development programs where a teacher spends a few weeks in a work setting over the summer as part of their professional development, understanding what are the demands of the workplace today? What are the demands in the workplaces that are contributing the highest value added of the economy? What is it that students should know? And bring that knowledge to the school as they engage in conversations with their colleagues and decide what should our students learn. They would discover that one of the most important skills that people need to have is the capacity to receive feedback from others and to use that feedback constructively, and the capacity to work in teams and to coordinate. And how many schools provide students the opportunity to actually get good at using feedback for the purpose of continuous learning and self-improvement or working in teams? So I think these are some of the avenues that we have. What I don't want to minimize in any way the gravity of the crisis that we're in. I think that nothing less than the future of democracy is at stake in Latin America if this crisis is not addressed. Because democracy is an invention alongside the public school, and democracy cannot function with an ignorant population, sadly, as we see in many democracies around the world that are stumbling because people are not well educated. And whether this is the United States or Brazil or Mexico, the story is the same everywhere. So the future of democracy, the future of prosperity, the future of progress as we know it is in education. I think that to seize the potential that this crisis gives us to create a renaissance is going to require that we all step up to it. And not just the educators, not just the teachers, not just the ministries of education, not just the universities, but the whole of society. This is a time when everyone should look in the mirror and ask, am I doing everything that is within my power and more? And the reason I think, to conclude, we should be doing that, if we go back 100 years to the pandemic of 1918, which, as everybody knows, brought about the breakdown of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler to power, I am sure that if you analyze that terrible time of the 18 years between 1918 and 1936, when Hitler was elected, there were so many people who turned a blind eye to what was happening, who could have done more and didn't. University professors who began to see how the party, the Nazi party, was taking control of universities and was essentially requiring people to commit loyalty to a Nazi ideology to keep their jobs, and who did nothing, who said, this is not my business. And of course, who later came to regret it. So I think this is not a different moment. I don't know whether fascism is what will come after this pandemic if we don't act, but I am certain that we each have the power to steer this region towards either a more prosperous, open, democratic future, or to hope that someone else will solve the problem and then get to lament our own lack of leadership.
Your view that it's all of us that are on the line here, and it's really a comprehensive view of what can be done, which just sounds it sounds doable if we take the human element out of this, right? A society that is polarized and divided and incredibly unequal. And Claudia, I'd like to go to you on this. Because you actually wrote that equality should be an obsession for us right now. So we were already somewhat on that path. The quality for public schools was, divergent from private schooling at a really steep level, and now of course this has become a completely like a two-world situation. And the podcast, Fernando, you with Brian, you actually said it's a tale of two cities that we're living. So with this, and considering that you have parents who are themselves not educated and have a hard time helping their children or even allowing their children to continue studying. So with this the element of the inequality and this steep gap that has surged now, where do we go? How do we implement these ideas, and what do you think would be the priority here? You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. We're all going to have to pay pennies. That's why we put coins in the quarters in the middle here.
Yes. So thank you for the question. And it's very challenging to speak after Fernando has shown the many possibilities that crisis can bring along. And I want to first talk a little bit about why obsession with equality or equity, and then to go the same route as Fernando on the solutions. So first, look at my own country, Brazil. Brazil is one of the most socially unequal countries. And if we look at the PISA ranking on equality in education, we are the second worst. The second more unequal country among the 79 that participated in PISA 2018. So it doesn't happen by chance that we are so unequal. You have to make equality, equity part of the agenda. And crisis, as Fernando has highlighted, are opportunities to innovate, to think out of the box. And we should take this opportunity. I just reading about the 1918 big flu, the so-called Spanish flu that had nothing to do with Spain alone. It amazed me how at that time the preparing for the profession of physician was changed exactly at that time. So in this small sense, it makes a lot of sense. It makes sense to think big and how this crisis can help us shape a different future, or as the book of Fernando says, building back better. And it's feasible in Latin America. It's feasible if we think that in isolation, we had, as IDB has shown, the biggest, the longest closure of schools, 230 days. In average in Brazil, it's 260 days. We were one of, if not the worst case, one of the worst case in the case of Brazil. So first, what have we learned concretely during this period? We have learned that first, that teachers can teach, even basic education teachers, through digital platforms or TV, or specially prepared documents that could be sent at home. That interaction with parents was feasible. I was I am still during the pandemic, the advisor of 53 subnational ministers of education in the country. And I talked to many groups of teachers. For example, I had one live with indigenous education teachers that were talking about the connection with parents. And then I realized that talking to teachers in Pernambuco, which is a poor state in Brazil, but that has developed its education better than many richest states, that teachers were worried how to talk with parents of children with disabilities, how to support what they do so as to stimulate the brains of their kids and ensure some learning in hard situations, in difficult situations. So this learning can and must be brought back to school, be it the physical space of school, be it without the walls that schools have. Schools have just restarted in most parts of Latin America, reopened in a very challenging situation because the figures of Omicron are very high still. And but the teachers got 3 shots, and so it's the safest as far as the epidemiologists speak. It's the safest place to be for, especially for vulnerable kids, is the school right now. But we have to go back to school with those lessons learned in our minds. One thing that Fernando has mentioned is the personalization. Now we have, even in Argentina, in Brazil, and especially in Uruguay, the tools we need to personalize learning, to identify precisely what are the gaps in learning and address the kids to the digital classes that they need to take, not to just receive content, but to be able to broaden their cultural and scientific repertoire, and the teacher using the best of her abilities to teach kids to be independent thinkers. Otherwise, we won't build the democracy that we are all looking for. Unfortunately, the anti-democratic trend in Latin America is very strong. I'm a member of a civil society organization called Comissão Arns that fights for human rights, and violence is huge. In not only violence, but hurting human rights is viewed in some of our countries as something very acceptable, including the right of children to have a proper childhood and not to be involved in child labor, which is happening in increasing numbers in Brazil and the rest of Latin America.
I want to get back to you on that issue, because I think violence is a major hurdle that we've been suffering way before pandemic. But Fernando, I want to get back to what you said about this whole of society. There's a role here for this encompassing action. But would you say that that policymakers have a role or a duty in actually coordinating or pushing this forward, or and in that case, if there are if policymakers have a role in making this whole of society push, or at least create incentives, what should be the priorities? Because we have the long-term redefining of education, under our understanding of education, but we have kids right now going back into school and catching up, so to speak. So yeah, what would be the priorities?
Most certainly governments have a very important role, but I want to underscore that one of the most consequential decisions that policymakers could make right now is to create the opportunity to continue and to strengthen the partnerships with civil society organizations to work in education. One of the great innovations in education in Latin America since the 1990s in education has been the rise of civil society organizations that have partnered with government for the purpose of education. And for reasons that are easy to understand, autocratic leaders, which are rising in Latin America, don't like civil society. Putin doesn't like it the same way that Maduro doesn't like them in Venezuela, the same way any dictator hates civil society organized. What they want is a direct connection to the masses and for the people to be directly dependent on the leader. But for that very reason, because it is a bulwark of democracy. Civil society is. It is very important for policy to allow those partnerships. And if you look at the pandemic, actually, some of the best examples of success were the State Secretary of Education of Sao Paulo. What was the very first thing he did when the government decided to shut down the schools? He reached out to the private sector, to business leaders, and he said, work with me. Let's build an alternative way to deliver education. You look at the Secretary of Education of Bogota or the Minister of Education of Colombia. That's exactly what they did. So I want to underscore that's a very, very important issue that should be on the table. Regulations should make it easier and not harder for people other than governments to be a part of the solution of building a renaissance. We have in front of us a tremendous opportunity. UNESCO, in its 77 years, has only 3 times put together an independent commission that has looked at the risks of the future and that has developed a blueprint for education reform. The first time it did that was in 68. Second time it did that was in 92. And in November of 2021, a report from an independent commission of UNESCO was just released. And this report, unlike the previous 2, doesn't present itself from a blueprint that says this is what the world should do, but actually it presents itself as an invitation to a dialogue stating the most important thing this report could do would be to promote a whole of society mobilization around education. And I think it's no accident that this message is there in the middle of the pandemic. What this report is acknowledging is that unless there is a whole of society mobilization and participation and concern and energy around education, this could be the most serious crisis of public education. My invitation to everyone who's listening is to find this report. It's published in multiple languages. And the report says each and every one of you, whether you're a student, a parent, a teacher, an employer, a member of a leader of a civil society organization, has the opportunity to read this report, to reach out to those within your circle of influence and to ask, what does that mean for us? The report begins with 2 chapters that talk about the looming challenges of our time, the challenges of human rights, of democratic backsliding, of growing poverty and inequality, and of climate change. And the report says we need a big effort to realign education systems, to develop the capacities of people to address these challenges, or we may not survive as a species, or certainly the world which was built on the premise that human rights should be a reality may not survive. So I think that, to me, that is the most important thing that governments can do. Of course, there are other smaller things that could be done. As we are speaking, take Brazil. As the states are getting ready to go back to school, state and municipal secretaries of education are actually developing strategies for how they plan to do it. Those strategies have a theory of action. A collective good, a common good that could be produced would be to partner with those states and revise those plans and help them enhance those plans. Brazil has a phenomenal institutional innovation in the form of the Council of State Secretaries of Education, where these secretaries get together often and they exchange lessons from experience. Actually, had it not been for that council, the education crisis would have been worse in Brazil because the national government was essentially missing in action. So this story, whatever educational opportunity was maintained during this pandemic in Brazil, it was thanks to the leadership of state and local leaders and organizations of civil society that worked with them to fill the vacuum that was left by a government that was missing. Not very different in Mexico, by the way, not very different in the United States. And so I think that at this moment, as state and local governments are putting together plans, there is an opportunity for a whole of society effort, perhaps coordinated by channels like the State Council of Education Secretaries with support from others in education and the private sector to ensure that those strategies are the best strategies given the best knowledge that we have right now, and that there is funding for those strategies. I want to underscore that it is very important to maintain the financial priority of education at this time. You can predict that given the health emergency and the recessionary impact of the pandemic, the path of least resistance for many governments is going to be to diminish the financial commitments to education. And that's going to make a bad situation a lot worse. I'm not suggesting that this crisis can be resolved only with money, but it cannot be resolved without money either. You cannot expect that systems squeeze water out of the stones simply because they have good ideas or they're managing things well. And I think that is an effort where if you get the most influential business leaders of a society, if you get the multinational firms that have a vested interest in a continuation of productivity, skill, population, and in democratic and rule of law, if you get them to understand that no one with a good plan should be unable to implement it because they lack resources, I think we can overcome this crisis. So these are some of the things that I believe governments can do.
Yeah. See education not as an expenditure, but as an investment, right? Which we just saw it in Brazil. They just cut.
And as a shared responsibility with civil society. There is a very harmful ideology returning to Latin America that is basically maligning all this involvement of civil society in education. And that is saying this should be the government, this old notion that the state alone should be running the society has actually not produced very good results historically in Latin America. So, why become the Soviet Union of the 1920s when you could actually lead and mobilize the whole of society when we have the tools to do that?
I just want to do a quick reminder to our audience that you can send your questions. You can use send it over WebEx or tweet at us with the hashtag at ASCOA, and we'll take your questions as well. But maligning social social society, civil society, but also this distancing from private sector to many areas where we see, several countries where the federal government is missing in action, as you mentioned, the example of Brazil. But this happens, and we see, especially in areas that have been left behind for some time, way before the pandemic, where we just wanted to go back to the issue of violence and is there a role for private sector, for civil society to try to curb that, because these are areas where governments are missing in action. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the situations that we have neither in urban or rural areas across the region where violence is endemic, right? As you said, Claudia.
Yes. So first, let me comment on the role of civil society, because Fernando is absolutely right. The federal government, in the case of Brazil, has been absent for most of the time of the school closures from organizing or preparing an educational response to COVID, which is really a pity. But on the other hand, in Brazil, there was created, and in Argentina, they are attempting to do it as well, an ecosystem of educational support organizations from the civil society to help this council of state level leaders, where they exchange good practice, they socialize good ideas, they prepare, because it's important to notice that states have a role towards their own municipalities. And 80% of the municipalities in Brazil don't have more than 4 schools. It's not that they have some headquarters of the subnational or municipal secretariat of education. They need support from their own states. And so this CONCED, which is the name of this council, was extremely important, not only to address the state level school system, but even the municipalities that needed support for elementary education and nursery schools during this period in the absence of the federal government. But talking about violence, which was your question, Cecilia, violence for me is fostered when you have huge social inequalities. More than poverty, violence arouses when you don't see any way out of the cage where you are enclosed in socially. And this has become a big problem in Brazil. And part of it has captured even the security forces with the building of militias. We have now not only the problem of the drug dealers, but of militias that discovered that they become more potent, selling private security for citizens and taking over their business of drug dealing as well. So they are the new drug dealers. They are the new insurers of paid safety. And this is a disaster for democracy. So the solution is not easy to be built, and it transcends education. But if we teach students, student agency, that they are the builders of their own lives and that they have to be active citizens in the multitude of communities that are built together so as from the school community up to global citizenship, you can change mindsets, you can change the prevalent culture. And civil society is playing a role, including in this, not only in support, learning, insurance, delivering learning at home for students and supporting school leaders and school system leaders, but also in promoting student agency and giving some kind of civic educations for the kids in Brazil. And I hope this trend continues, because resistance is very needed in violent societies.
If I could add one comment to your earlier question of what can governments do. As I reflect on what we have studied over the last 2 years, it seems to me that both governments and civil society organizations can have a laser-like focus on what is happening to the most vulnerable children with good results. So an example of a government doing that is the government of Portugal, who at the beginning of the pandemic put together a set of criteria to guide how they're going to handle the pandemic. And one of them was, we need, for every decision that we make, we need to ask, how is this impacting the most vulnerable kids? And when you do something as simple as that, when you think about them, it leads you to put in place compensatory mechanisms, so that if you are planning your strategy for continuity online and you realize some kids don't have online, you create alternative pathways, or you make it possible for them to have access. But civil society organizations in Latin America also played a very important role, having a laser-like focus on poor kids. So I will give you 2 examples. In Chile, there is an organization managed by the Society of Jesus, by the Jesuits, that worked with street children who have been abused by their families and who have lost trust in adults. And it's helping them develop the equivalent of a high school curriculum through accelerated learning, but also helping rebuild their social emotion, their trust in grown-ups. And when this pandemic hit, and these kids had to go back to the street or wherever they live, the organization understood, we are the only adults these children live. We have to keep that connection. And they manage in very creative ways, using WhatsApp and putting together a whole team of psychologists to remain present in the lives of those kids. Also in Chile, the organization Enseña por Chile, part of this network, which works with fairly disadvantaged communities, was able to do, before any other government agency did, develop alternative ways to deliver curriculum using WhatsApp to highly marginalized populations. So obviously, if you have either a government or an organization who has a specific focus on the poor, then you're more likely, obviously, to have solutions for them than if you are a national government that has all kinds of priorities, no strategy, no focus, and no legs, no capacity to execute.
Yeah, so we're seeing that it's sort of like, it's not just throw a laptop or a book at a kid, even though the hole in the wall experiments show that they will fend for themselves, but it takes more than that, right? So there is a question coming here that I think sort of addresses that as well, to keep them, which is the question of dropouts. The person asking us, concerns that children that were not able to access online classes during the pandemic that may not actually return to school, but there's also the ones that even if they had access, just lost interest because there was no community, so to speak. So how can that be mitigated or mediated? Claudia, you want to take that?
Yes, definitely. So dropping out of school is a big issue in Latin America, and it is fed through two things that build together, which is kids are already over age for their grades in many parts of Latin America. So if they repeat a grade, second fact, they will leave school because their parents believe that they don't have what is needed to have success in schools. But with the pandemic, that became even worse because some teachers were advocating for increasing the repetition rate with kids that are already over age because they didn't participate properly in the activities or you name it. They didn't learn how to read and write. And so there was a big push from civil society not to make them repeat and to build accelerated tracks for the kids that are already over age. And this worked. And it was extremely important. More than having kids repeat and then leave school, it's important to do as UNICEF has helped many countries to do, which is to have an active search for the kids that were not returning or not participating in the emergency remote learning. And it's not that the problem is solved right now, but if that mitigation action didn't happen, it would have been even worse. And we have to be attentive in the years to follow because I think we didn't fully recover from this terrible trend.
Yeah, and Fernando, you mentioned the Jesuit group specifically in Chile, but there's a question here about exactly the role of religious schools and private schools in the recovery. And I'll expand that question a little bit also on the trend for privatizing and privatization of education that we see in many countries in Latin America, whether this should coexist or the push should be more in public education. How do you see that trend? Can that help the recovery?
I think even the language of privatizing education sometimes is tainted and comes out of the assumption that there is something inherently negative about that. And the way I think about it, private institutions exist for a reason. They exist because the parents who send their children to those schools want to do that, and they fund them. I don't think they should be subsidized by taxpayers for sure, but I think that they have a perfect right to exist, and there are smart ways to make them engines of improvement of the entire system. Let me give you an example of that. Former Minister of Education of Colombia, Cecilia Maria Vélez, almost 20 years ago, essentially put out a concept, made it a program that created network of schools, of highly vulnerable schools, connected with private schools and with universities for the purpose of educational improvement. And so an example of that is the Alianza Educativa. But the Alianza Educativa, it's a network that includes the Universidad de los Andes, one of the leading private universities in Brazil, includes a number of private schools, and serves, I think it's 11,000 highly vulnerable children. The Alianza Educativa is absolutely a hub of innovation to serve poor kids, not only the 11,000 who live there, but others. Now, to me, that's an example of the capacity to think not as either or, but both. And of actually, it's not very different from what you see happening in Shanghai, for example, as a way to improve the performance of the schools that are least performing by coupling them with the highest performing schools, in their case, mostly public schools. So I don't think that the question of whether there should be private schools or not. Private schools and private institutions, both universities, high schools, elementary schools, and daycares are a reality. And they should be an option. People should have a right to choose. I do not think that they should be subsidized by taxpayers. I think that taxpayers should be funding public schools, and I think every society should have a strong public education system. I think we all, whether our kids go to public or private schools, have an interest in having excellent public education systems and in making sure they're well funded, well led, well managed, and that they exist primarily to serve the interest of children and not the interest of the adults who benefit at the expense of children, whether those are vendors who sell products or teacher union leaders or bureaucrats who see them as employment pastures, essentially. And so I think that's what we have to build, good public education systems. But to me, the debate, that is the question of the private sector and not so on, is a distraction. This is a time when it's important to be really clear-eyed about what are the priorities, what is going to help us get to the Renaissance, and not to be distracted by things that are really a footnote, really a small conversation in terms of the larger picture.
I can't believe that we're almost done with our hour here. I mean, I have like another book of questions for you both because it's just so interesting. I just wanted to give you the floor for final considerations, a couple of minutes. What do you say? I mean, we are all, as you're saying, we're all Medicis here, right? We should all be fostering this. We're all part of the solution. So, so you can give us our, your final conclusion or your pitch for us to take our role of in this Renaissance. Claudia, I'll start with you then.
Yes. So first, thank you for the interaction. We all learn through this kind of dialogues. But I want to say that we are living very difficult times. I don't want to, by talking about solutions, forget that so many people have died. And now let me be specific about my own country. Yes, it's more than 600,000 people that died in Brazil, almost 650,000. And many people lost their income. The situation is sad. I mentioned previously child labor and other sad facts. But it's very nice to hear about the possibility of, as Fernando Raimes mentioned, a renaissance, that we can build a better world after so much suffering. And that is what makes me wake up every day to think about this possibility and the idea that we are the adults in the room and we are supposed to think about the next generation, help them build a better world. And I'm putting myself at your disposition. I write every day only about education on Twitter, and my Twitter is @ClaudiaCostin. Should you have any unanswered questions, I'll be very pleased to interact more with everyone that listens to us right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Fernando.
So I want to thank you, Cecilia and Claudia, for this conversation. And I want to thank those who've taken time to listen today, because I think that is the first step that we're going to, on which we're going to build a renaissance. It's each one of us taking an interest and asking, what can I do to be helpful? I think we're living extraordinary times. And I want to build on what Claudia just said. She was one of the leaders actually in the world when she was secretary in using these new technologies, Twitter, to communicate with the public. I think that the technologies that we have available to ourselves give us extraordinary opportunity for a new form of power, for citizenship power, for each one of us to play a role in building this renaissance. And so that's why I'm tremendously hopeful and optimistic that we will be able to make the best out of this crisis. And I would like to conclude inviting everyone listening to taking an interest in this report titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. Just Google that name or just Google UNESCO Futures of Education, read the report or read the executive summary and ask, what can I do? How can I begin a conversation with others? Because the tools, the technological tools that Claudia is talking about, gives each one tremendous power to be in conversation, not just with the people who you are in close proximity to. Each one of you can be having a conversation with can reach just about anyone. We're connected to other people to anyone in the world by less than 6 degrees of preparation. So I am incredibly hopeful of the possibilities in front of us. But of course, in the end, whether we build a renaissance or not is going to depend on how we respond to the ethical imperative that Claudia has just mentioned. How do we think about our obligations to the next generation? If we decide that that is important enough for all of us to pay attention and to look in the mirror, then I think we're going to build a renaissance. If we decide that that should be a concern of the back seat and that other needs in the present are going to take priority, then the future is potentially a lot more grim.
Can't add any more words to this. Thank you both so much. Thank you for your expertise, sharing your expertise today, and thank you for everything you do. I'm looking forward to that renaissance. I always thank everybody that's watching us today, and CEBRI, of course, for the partnership. Check America's quarterly online. It's free. You can access and check out the issue. And I look forward to seeing you all again here at some point for discussing the next steps on the renaissance.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.